Not the kind of tired that comes from effort, not the kind that sleep immediately repairs, but a softer, heavier fatigue, the kind that sits quietly behind your thoughts. You don't always recognize it as exhaustion. Sometimes it feels like distance, sometimes like numbness, sometimes like a vague sense that you're present but not entirely here. And at some point, usually when the world finally goes quiet, a question surfaces. When did this become normal for me? That question doesn't appear suddenly. It forms slowly, across years, across different versions of you that learned how to adapt to each stage of life. Mental health isn't shaped by a single moment. It's shaped by time, by repetition, by what you learn to feel and what you learn to hide. From the very beginning, you weren't taught mental health. You were taught behavior. You were taught what worked, what earned approval, what reduced tension. Before you ever understood emotions, your nervous system was already learning patterns. You noticed which reactions softened the room, which expressions were welcomed, which needs were inconvenient. So you adjusted. Not consciously, not deliberately. You adapted the way humans always have, by sensing safety. And that adaptation followed you. As a child, you may have learned to be easy, to be quiet, to be helpful, to be strong earlier than you should have been. Or maybe you learned to be impressive, achieving, competent, reliable. Whatever the shape, the lesson underneath was the same. This is how I stay connected. This is how I belong. And that lesson didn't disappear as you grew older. It matured. It became personality. It became identity. It became the way people described you. You're so calm. You're always there. You handle things so well. And maybe that was true, but it was also incomplete. Because while you were learning how to function, you were also learning which parts of yourself were allowed to exist. What most people don't realize is that mental health across a lifespan isn't just about emotional stability, it's about emotional permission. Permission to feel without immediately managing it. Permission to need without apologizing. Permission to exist without performing usefulness. If you didn't learn that permission early, you learned something else instead. You learned to suppress, to delay, to redirect. You learned to tell yourself, it's not that bad. Other people have it worse. I'll deal with it later. And later became adulthood. By then, you were capable, functional, responsible. You paid bills, you showed up, you kept things moving. From the outside, your life may have looked stable, even successful. But internally, something felt off. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to make you feel slightly disconnected from yourself. This is where lifespan mental health becomes difficult to name. Because there isn't always a clear problem, there's just a quiet accumulation. Small daily sacrifices, moments where you said yes instead of no, times you swallowed frustration to keep peace, conversations where you chose understanding over honesty. Each moment seemed insignificant, but together they formed a pattern of self-adjustment that slowly became self-erasure. You might notice it in how easily you prioritize others, how uncomfortable it feels to rest without justification, how guilt appears when you consider choosing yourself. That guilt didn't come from nowhere, it came from conditioning. Your nervous system learned early on that connection required regulation, that being attuned to others mattered more than being attuned to yourself. So your body learned to scan, to anticipate, to respond before being asked. That's not weakness, that's intelligence. But intelligence used for survival doesn't always translate into well-being. And this is where it gets deeper. As you move through adulthood, life asks more of you, more responsibility, more emotional labor, more endurance. If your internal system is still operating on survival rules formed early on, the load becomes heavier. You give from a place of obligation
rather than choice. You help while quietly resenting the expectation. You show up while feeling increasingly invisible. And because you're still functioning, you may not recognize this as burnout. You might just feel irritable, or detached, or strangely empty after social interactions. You might notice that joy feels muted, that excitement fades quickly, that you don't know what you want when someone asks. That uncertainty can be unsettling, because identity is supposed to solidify with age. But when identity is built around being needed, being good, being adaptable, it can blur. You know who you are to others, but you're less sure who you are to yourself. Some people reach this awareness through therapy, some through conflict, others through quiet breakdowns that don't look like breakdowns at all. And some never reach it consciously. They just feel tired for a long time. There's no judgment here. Mental health isn't a moral achievement. It's an ongoing negotiation between who you were, who you became, and who you're allowed to be now. What most people don't realize is that emotional exhaustion isn't always about doing too much. Sometimes it's about being too much of one version of yourself. The agreeable one, the dependable one, the emotionally mature one. Those roles are praised, rewarded, expected, but they rarely come with space. Space to feel confused, space to be inconsistent, space to need care without providing it in return. And over time, that imbalance creates tension. You may feel resentment and immediately suppress it. You may feel anger and reframe it as understanding. You may feel sadness and tell yourself to be grateful instead. Each time you do this, you're not failing emotionally. You're following an old rule, a rule that once kept you safe. But here's what's interesting. The strategies that protect you early in life can quietly limit you later. They keep you functional, but not necessarily fulfilled. They keep relationships stable, but not always authentic. They help you survive, but they don't always help you feel alive. This is the paradox of lifespan mental health. What once worked may now cost you. Kindness without boundaries becomes depletion. Responsibility without rest becomes resentment. Empathy without reciprocity becomes loneliness. And yet, letting go of those patterns can feel dangerous, because if your sense of worth was built on being needed, what happens when you stop? If your identity formed around being the stable one, who are you when you're uncertain? These aren't abstract questions, they're felt questions. They live in your body as tension, as fatigue, as a subtle sense of being misaligned with your own life. What most people don't realize is that boundaries aren't about control, they're about containment. They protect your internal resources, they signal self-respect. But if you grew up learning that your needs disrupted others, boundaries can feel like rejection. So instead of setting them, you internalize, you push through, you minimize, you redirect. And adaptation over decades shapes mental health more than trauma ever could have. Because it's constant, because it's normalized, because it's praised. At some point, you might notice that you don't feel deeply anymore. Not sadness, not joy, just a dull steadiness. That numbness isn't failure, it's protection. Your system learned that intensity wasn't safe, so it lowered the volume. This happens quietly. You still laugh, you still care, but something feels muted. And that can be confusing, because nothing is wrong enough to justify how you feel. So you question yourself instead. Why am I like this? What's wrong with me? But there may be nothing wrong at all. You may simply be carrying patterns that were never meant to last a lifetime. Mental health across the lifespan isn't about pathology, it's about permission. Permission to update old rules, permission to feel without immediately fixing, permission to disappoint without collapsing. But permission is hard when you've been conditioned to perform stability. You may notice fear when you consider slowing down, anxiety when you imagine saying no, guilt when you consider choosing yourself. Those reactions aren't signs that you're selfish. They're signs that your system is encountering something unfamiliar. And unfamiliar doesn't mean wrong. Some people act from awareness. They notice these patterns early. They question them gently. Others act from fear. They push through. They numb. They distract. Both are understandable. Both are human. Mental health isn't about choosing the right response. It's about understanding the origin of your responses. When you understand why you learn to be who you are, compassion becomes possible. Not performative compassion, internal compassion. The kind that doesn't rush you to change. Because not everything needs to be resolved. Some truths just need to be acknowledged. Like the truth that you've been strong for